The stone ceiling of ambition. History is a cold, unblinking eye, a witness to the fragile line between a crown and a corpse. We imagine power as an iron fortress, yet it is often held together by nothing more than the grace of a steady step and the absence of a low-hanging beam. To rule is to court the void, and for the young Charles VIII, the void was waiting in the shadows of an arched doorway. He inherited a kingdom from his father's cold remains at the age of 13, a boy king playing a man's game, while his sister, Anne, held the reins of France with a grip of steel for 8 long years. By the year 1491, the boy had grown into his crown and his ambitions. He sought security through the ink of peace treaties, closing the doors on old wars only to peer greedily through the windows of the Italian peninsula. The kingdom of Naples sat like a ripe fruit, and the Pope, a man of God with the heart of a strategist, whispered the sweet poison of conquest into the king's ear. Charles traded his defensive shield for an aggressor's blade, unaware that the Italian sun would set on his dreams of empire. The invasion of 1494 was a hollow triumph. Charles took Milan and Naples with the ease of a predator, only to realize that the Italian states had found the power of collective resistance. Driven back to France with nothing but a mountain of debt, the king found his treasury empty and his spirit redirected. He turned his gaze inward, seeking immortality through the arts and the lavish architecture of the French Renaissance. He sought joy in the game of the palm, a sport where men strike at fate with their bare hands. But fate strikes back with far more precision. On the 7th of April, 1498, while walking toward a match, the king's head met the stone frame of a doorway. A simple accident, a moment of clumsy mortality that the king attempted to shrug off with royal pride. He watched the game, silent and composed, until the hidden bleed in his mind claimed his consciousness. 9 hours later, the King of France was dead at 27. Leaving behind a fractured realm and a line of 6 children who had already preceded him into the earth. The harvest of hubris. In the ancient East, the chronicles of the state of Chin tell a darker, more visceral tale of the price of arrogance. Duke Ching was a man who understood the architecture of control, dividing his military into 6 branches to ensure that no single clan could rise against him. He was a master of domestic harmony, yet even the most disciplined mind cannot negotiate with the whispers of the supernatural. In the summer of 581 BC, a shaman looked into the duke's future and saw only a grave. The prophecy was precise: the duke would not live to taste the wheat of the coming harvest. Power often mistakes cruelty for a cure. Ching ordered the shaman executed, believing that by silencing the messenger, he could strike down the message itself. As the harvest approached, the duke sought to humiliate the ghost of the dead man. He commanded his farmers to reap the wheat early, mashing the unripe grain into a celebratory cake to prove his survival. It was a victory of the ego over the inevitable. But the unripe wheat was a poison of his own making, a heavy mass that his body could neither process nor ignore. The pain that followed was a slow, rhythmic undoing of his dignity. Stricken by a sudden, violent urgency, the duke retreated to the latrine, a place where even kings are stripped of their finery. In his weakened state, the ground gave way, or perhaps his balance simply failed. He plummeted into the cesspit below, drowning in the waste of his own kingdom. History does not always grant a noble end. Sometimes, it drowns the powerful in the very filth they sought to rise above, leaving a legacy of silence and rot. On the battlefields of the north, another man sought to carve his name into the stone of history. Stanislaus Leszczynski was a king twice crowned and twice removed, a piece on a chessboard played by the empires of Sweden and Russia. His legitimacy lasted only as long as Swedish steel remained sharp. When the Great Northern War turned against his patrons, Stanislaus was swept into exile, a king without a country. He waited in the shadows, using his daughter's marriage to the King of France as a bridge back to power, only to find that the throne of Poland was a seat made of glass. The pyre of a twice-crowned king. The year 1733 brought a second chance, and a second tragedy. Following the death of Augustus II, who succumbed to a gangrenous toe snapped off while entering a carriage, Stanislaus was re-elected. Yet, Russia's shadows were long and cold. The War of the Polish Succession claimed 88,000 lives, proving that a crown is often paid for in the blood of those who will never wear one. Forced to surrender his title, Stanislaus was granted a consolation of luxury, the Duchy of Lorraine. There, he traded the sword for the pen, living a quiet life of philosophy and French wine. But peace is a deceptive mistress. In February of 1766, the 88-year-old duke sat by his fireplace, draped in the heavy silk robes of a forgotten era. Sleep, the gentle cousin of death, took him in his armchair. A rogue spark, small and silent, found the hem of his garment. It did not merely burn, it consumed. By the time the servants smelled the charring of royal silk, the flames had already claimed the left side of his body, searing 8 centimeters deep into his flesh. The struggle for survival was a slow descent into agony. For 13 days, his physicians applied lotions and prayers to skin that was no longer his own. Then, the inevitable rot began. Gangrene turned the Duke's final days into a living purgatory, his hand burning down to the bone before his heart finally ceased its labor. He left his territories to France, a final transaction in a life defined by the loss of land and the gain of scars. Further south, in the heart of Hungary, Bela the Bison learned that the foundation of power is often as unstable as the wood it is built upon. He was a man of immense physical prowess, a warrior who had seized the throne from his brother, Andrew, in 1060. He offered clemency to his enemies, seeking to stabilize a realm built on betrayal. Yet, the Holy Roman Empire loomed on his borders, a predator waiting for a sign of weakness. Bela prepared for war, but the greatest threat was not an invading army, it was the chair upon which he sat. The fragile weight of the throne. In the summer of 1063, while the king sat in council, the very symbol of his authority became his executioner. The royal throne, perhaps weary from the weight of a usurper, collapsed with a sudden, violent splintering of wood. Bela was crushed beneath the ruins of his own seat of power. He lingered for several weeks, a broken giant in a broken kingdom, before the injuries claimed him at the age of 45. His nephew, Solomon, took the throne after it had been properly repaired, a grim reminder that the state survives long after the individual is buried. The 19th century offered no more mercy to those of noble blood. Archduchess Matilda of Austria was a creature of high expectations and hidden vices. At 18, she was a pawn in the grand game of European diplomacy, betrothed to the Crown Prince of Italy to heal the wounds of empire. But Matilda sought refuge from the pressures of her lineage in the forbidden haze of tobacco. Her father, the Archduke, had forbidden the habit, making every cigarette a calculated act of rebellion. In May of 1867, dressed in a gown of exquisite, highly flammable fabric for a night at the theater, Matilda lit a final cigarette. When she heard her father's footsteps, she did what any panicked child would do, she hid the evidence behind her back. The silk ignited instantly. The screams that followed were the only sounds in a room suddenly filled with fire. She survived the initial inferno, but the medical science of 1867 could only offer ointments where it needed miracles. She died of infection 3 weeks later, a victim of a secret she couldn't keep. Our final witness to the absurdity of death is Alexander of Greece, a king who found himself a prisoner of his own palace during the chaos of the First World War. In 1920, while walking through the royal gardens, he attempted to protect his dog from the fury of a steward's pet monkey. A second beast, a Barbary macaque, sank its teeth into the king's flesh. The bites were small, seemingly trivial, yet they carried the seeds of sepsis. Within hours, a fever took hold that no doctor dared to treat with a knife. At 27, the king succumbed to a bite from a creature he was meant to rule, proving that in the eyes of nature, a crown is no armor at all.